Welcome back to Redbeard's Garage, and on today's episode we're going to be turning this Harbor Freight 22 horse V-twin into a supercharged fire-breathing monster. First we need to tear down this 670. We'll be taking off the plastics, throttle bracket, carb, manifold, ignition coils, and the starter. After taking off the fan, I use a pulley puller to remove the flywheel. After removing the flywheel, we can take off the heat shields and finish removing the starter. We can now remove the rockers, push rod, and heads. Open up the crankcase while making sure to remove the crank and cam spacers. Remove the cam and tappets, then unbolt the piston rods and remove the oil sensor. Slide the pistons out of the block and remove the crankshaft, and lastly pull out the governor arm while making sure to grab the washers on top of the rod. We're going to be using Performance 670's alternator kit to give us up to 70 amps of charging capabilities on this buggy. We'll be using their billet rods and their 20 over diamond billet pistons, so we're going to have to get this block bored out. We're using a set of heads that Performance 670 has milled 50 thousandths imported, using their heavy duty valve springs, their aluminum spring retainers, their roller rockers, and chrome ollie push rods. We'll also be using one of their billet flywheels, and we got a custom ground cam that Performance 670 has made up specifically for this supercharged engine. For our supercharger, we're going to be using an AMR 300 blower. This is going to make a perfect amount of boost on this 670cc V-twin. To get the power to the ground, we're going to be using a Polaris style pulley. This is like what you would see on a Magnum, Sportsman, or even a Razor. So this should help us get the power to the ground in this V-twin blown monster. After getting the block back from the machine shop from boring, we need to tap the oil sensor hole and governor hole for blocking off. Make sure to clean any material from the block and use red Loctite on the bolts. We can now start prepping our pistons and rods. We need to gap our rings for boost. The reason you want to set your ring gap properly, especially in a boosted application, is because the hotter your engine gets, the more the metal is going to expand. So when a ring expands, you want enough room so those ends don't push against each other and push outward, and you can end up breaking a ring and causing a ton of damage in your engine. You also don't want too much of a gap, because then you're going to have compression loss by the compression blowing past the rings. This is always going to happen in the engine. That's why you're going to always have some sort of blow by and run a PCV valve on your engine. But you don't want excess blow by, because then you're just pushing fuel mixture and everything into your oil, and that's going to hurt the lifespan of your oil. So make sure to set your ring gap to what your preferences are and what you're going to be using your engine for. Start off by sliding the ring into the bore using the piston to square it up. Use a feeler gauge to check the ring gap in the bore. Most aftermarket pistons come with a chart to determine ring gap. When gapping rings, there are several different methods. I'm demonstrating using a ring grinding tool. Grind the ring by spinning the wheel inward towards the ring. Make sure to take off small amounts and recheck often. Push the ring ends together to make sure you have a uniform edge. File off any burrs left from gapping. You will have 5 rings per piston, 2 oil rings, an oil spacer ring, first compression and second compression ring. Install the spacer for the oil rings on the piston first. Then install oil ring on top and bottom of the spacer. Next, install the second compression ring with the letter or number facing up. This will be the black faced ring. Now you can install the top compression ring with the chrome face, making sure the letter or number is facing up as well. Now we need to check our oil clearance on the rod bearings. Place a glove or soft jaws into the vise and clamp a piston rod into it without damaging it. Remove the rod cap and install the rod bearings by lining up the notches. Install the crankshaft onto the rod. Place a small piece of plastic gauge onto the rod journal and torque down the rod cap. This will tell us our oil clearance between the bearing and the crank. If this measurement is too small, we need to turn our crank. If it is too large, we'll need to get oversized bearing. Oil the rod bolts and torque down to 8 foot-pounds and work your way up to 20 foot-pounds while alternating from bolt to bolt, adding 4 foot-pounds at a time until 20 foot-pounds is reached. Once torqued, we can remove the cap to check our clearances. On this engine we're shooting for no more than 4 thousandths and no less than 2 thousandths. Our clearance is 3 thousandths, so we're good to scrape off the plastic gauge and install into the engine. Make sure to check both piston rods on the crank. With the oil clearance checked, we can install the rod onto the piston. Install the wrist pin clip into one side of the piston. Oil and slide the wrist pin through the piston into the rod. Then you can install the opposite clip. Make sure to check your orientation of your rods before installing onto the piston. Oil the crankshaft and slide it back into the block. You can see how one side of the rod has a flat side and the other side has a ridge. The flat sides of the rods go together against one another. Oil and slide the piston into a ring compressor, leaving the skirts hanging out. Make sure to seat the compressor all the way against the block and tap the piston into the sleeve with the handle of a hammer. Slide the rod onto the crank and oil the bearings. Repeat the rod cap torque process used earlier. Place a small amount of grease onto the cam tappets or cam followers when installing them to hold them into place. Install the cam by lining up the dot on the cam gear as well as the crank. Use a punch to tap out the governor gear. Make sure to remove the washer behind the gear, and then you can fill the remaining hole with RTV. If using RTV on the side cover, install the Performance 670 shims. If you're using the stock gasket, use the original shims that came on the engine. Install the lower left and upper right dowels into the block before installing the crankcase cover. I have used a small amount of gray RTV on the side cover. Torque the side cover to 18 foot-pounds. After lapping the valves, we can install our springs and retainers into our head. Linked below the video is the valve spring compressor that I like to use. Compress the spring down and dip the retainer in some grease to hold them on the stem of the valve. Release the compressor and repeat on the other valves. I had Performance 670 O-ring my heads for added safety. Install the copper O-ring in the milled groove. Cut the excess off without leaving a gap. Make sure the ring is pressed firmly into the groove. Now we can install our head dowels, gasket, and head. Oil the head bolts and torque down to 26 foot-pounds. Start at 10 foot-pounds, working your way up to 26 by adding 5 foot-pounds at a time until reaching the 26 foot-pound. Install the push rods, rockers, and rocker pin and tighten the pin screws. With the piston at top dead center, we can set exhaust lash to 10 thousandths and intake to 8 thousandths. Oil the valve train and place the O-ring into the covers before installing. Place valve grinding compound onto the crank. Install the flywheel and spin it back and forth to mate the surfaces. Make sure to clean up all the compound and install the key. We need to remove the starter ring from the original flywheel. Place the stock flywheel into the freezer to help with the removal. After removing the ring, heat it up and it'll help it to slide onto the billet flywheel. Install the shrouds and the starter before installing the flywheel. Torque the starter down to 30 foot-pounds. Now we can install the flywheel and torque down to 55 foot-pounds. I use a modified CVT pulley to hold the crank from spinning while torquing down the flywheel. Install the ignition coils and wire retainers. Set the coil gap to 40 thousandths. Guys, thank you so much for watching today's video. Make sure to check out all the links in the video's description. They help out the channel a ton, and we put every part we use on this engine and most of the tools used to make this build happen. Big thanks to Performance 670 for sending out the parts to do this build and supporting this whole supercharged setup. Make sure to stay tuned to the channel where you'll get to see this thing actually make 10 pounds of boost and perform like crazy. We're getting the CVT setup worked out on it and a few tuning bugs, but this thing performs amazingly and makes a ton of power, so we can't wait to dyno it in an upcoming video. So stay tuned, enjoy the rest of the videos on the channel, and we love you, and God bless.